The courtroom was packed when the judge uttered the unthinkable: death penalty. Karoline Leavitt didn't flinch, but her dog did. Bruno, the loyal German shepherd at her feet, raised his head and locked eyes with the man who just sealed an innocent woman's fate. They thought the trial was over, the sentence final, but Bruno knew better. And when he stood up and barked once, everything unraveled in front of America. If you believe in truth, justice, and the power of standing up, even when it's hard, subscribe now, because this is the kind of story they don't want you to hear. But we'll keep telling it. It started like any other high-profile federal trial. The cold marble floors of the Washington, D.C. courthouse echoed with the footsteps of anxious spectators. Security guards stood tall, silent, hands hovering near holsters. The seal of the United States behind the judge's bench gleamed under sharp lights, but no one in the room felt clarity that morning. They felt dread. In the front row, Karoline Leavitt sat ramrod straight. Next to her, Bruno, a striking German shepherd with a scar over one eye and a look that suggested he saw more than humans ever could. Karoline's hands rested lightly on her lap, but her knuckles were white. She wasn't here for politics today. She was here because something stank bad. Across the courtroom, Officer Grace Dalton stood, shackled at the wrists. A former Marine turned law enforcement officer, Grace had served 22 years with distinction, not a blemish on her record. She'd saved lives, stopped traffickers, mentored at-risk kids. She was the kind of person small towns prayed for and cities quietly relied on. But now she stood condemned. Not by evidence, there was barely any of that, but by implication, by whispers, by the DOJ's relentless narrative that she had betrayed her country. "All rise," the bailiff commanded. The judge entered. An older man with a hard stare and an even harder heart, Judge Cyrus Maddox had made a career out of sending people away, to prison, to silence, sometimes to their deaths. Karoline watched him carefully. She had crossed paths with men like him before, those who cloaked their corruption in legal robes, those who worshipped the process but not the people. In the matter of the United States versus Officer Grace Dalton, Judge Maddox began, his voice booming with icy finality, "This court finds the defendant guilty of treason against the United States of America." There was a pause, for a breath, for a heartbeat. The sentence is death by lethal injection, effective within 30 days. The courtroom erupted. Someone dropped their phone. A woman sobbed. A man shouted, "She didn't do it!" before being dragged out by security. Reporters lunged forward, whispering into mics, scribbling notes, firing off texts. And Karoline? She didn't move. Bruno did. The dog rose to his feet slowly, his head turning not toward the judge, but toward the prosecution table. Karoline placed a firm hand on his shoulder. He stilled, but didn't sit. She leaned closer, whispering, "What is it, boy?" Bruno's ears perked. He was locked onto someone. A man in a gray suit. Agent Carter Wells, the lead federal witness, the one whose testimony had sealed Grace's fate. The one who, now that Karoline looked more closely, was sweating. Not just perspiring, dripping. Hands shaking as he fumbled with his files. Karoline's heart dropped. It wasn't just courtroom nerves. This man was hiding something. And Bruno knew it. Let me take you back to how Karoline even got involved. Because for her, this wasn't just another news cycle or political skirmish. This was personal. Officer Grace Dalton had once saved her younger cousin during an active shooter situation in Texas, shielded him with her body, took 2 bullets, and still returned fire to neutralize the threat. Karoline never forgot. Neither did her family. So when she got wind that Grace was being accused of conspiring with foreign agents, the kind of charge that ruins reputations and erases careers overnight, she showed up. Not just as a viewer, as a watchdog. She had brought Bruno with her every day, not for show, for truth. Bruno had served with Karoline's late brother, Michael, a Marine K-9 handler killed overseas. The dog had witnessed more corruption, deceit, and violence than most humans ever would. He had an unexplainable gift. He sensed deception, like others sensed scent. He knew when someone was faking. And as Karoline sat in the front row on that cold March morning, watching the verdict land like a hammer on a stained glass window, she saw something that chilled her more than the sentence itself. Bruno was growling. Low, steady, focused, at Agent Carter Wells. That night, Karoline returned home with Bruno and couldn't stop shaking. She sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open, trial footage playing frame by frame. Bruno rested on the floor beside her, eyes never leaving the screen. Karoline replayed Carter Wells' testimony. He had looked confident at first, a smirk, a little too polished, but something was wrong with his eyes. They darted, his fingers twitched, and every time he mentioned Grace's alleged confession, Bruno growled. Karoline paused the footage. "You see it too, don't you?" she asked. Bruno barked once. Sharp. Affirmative. She called her contacts, dug into Agent Wells' background. The man had been involved in at least 2 other cases where key evidence mysteriously vanished, where people were convicted with little more than hearsay. And in both cases, the defendants were individuals who had refused to participate in politically charged investigations. This wasn't incompetence. This was a pattern, a strategy, a purge. And Grace Dalton had just become the latest scapegoat. Karoline stood and stared at her wall of notes, printouts, red thread and pins forming a spiderweb of power and lies. "We're going back to court," she told Bruno. The dog wagged his tail once. They weren't done yet. Not even close. The sun hadn't yet risen over Washington, D.C. when Karoline slipped quietly out the front door, Bruno at her heel. The air was brisk, biting with early spring chill, but her mind was on fire. She had spent the entire night mapping the inconsistencies in the trial, and what she found chilled her to the core. Grace Dalton wasn't just the latest target. She was the example, a warning to others in uniform who still believed in the Constitution, who still followed conscience over commands. And Karoline knew that if she didn't act now, there wouldn't be a second chance. Bruno was restless, pacing in the back seat of Karoline's SUV as she drove through the quiet city streets. Not barking, just alert. His instincts had never failed her, and right now, Bruno knew what she knew. Grace had been silenced. Not by law, by design. You see, Grace Dalton had a history of standing up. She was the kind of cop who prayed before her shift and brought donuts to community Bible study after. The kind who pulled over kids not to ticket them, but to talk them out of joining gangs. But one rainy afternoon last October, her precinct commander asked her to sign off on a report. A false one. It claimed a warrantless search had been consensual. Grace refused. She wrote in clear handwriting, "This is unconstitutional. I will not perjure myself." 3 weeks later, she was under investigation. 2 months later, a new narrative had been born, one that painted her as a traitor with ties to foreign agitators. It was fiction, elegant fiction, crafted by people in suits and offices who had never once set foot on the dangerous streets Grace patrolled. And worse, it was working. Karoline knew this playbook. She had seen it in politics: smear, isolate, destroy. But this time, they had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated Bruno. She returned to the courthouse that afternoon, with purpose in her step and a dossier in hand. It wasn't enough to just be angry. She needed facts, proof, and she had them now. Internal memos, redacted email chains, one damning audio recording from a whistleblower in the DOJ. It was grainy, distorted, but you could still hear the words. "Make it stick. We can't have another uniformed insubordinate ruin this narrative. Get Wells to testify. If he blinks, replace him." Karoline listened to it 3 times. Bruno didn't move, just stared at her with knowing eyes. She picked up the phone and called a judge. Not Maddox, a different one. One she trusted. Judge Elaine Barnett, retired. She had once prosecuted war crimes. She had a spine. Karoline said 3 words. "I need help." The line went quiet. Then, where and when? Within 24 hours, Karoline had filed for an emergency motion, not to overturn the verdict, not yet. To submit new evidence. The press wasn't ready. The DOJ wasn't ready. Judge Maddox was definitely not ready. But Karoline was, and so was Bruno. The day of the hearing, the courtroom looked different, more crowded, tense. More than a few off-duty cops lined the walls. A handful of pastors sat in the back pews, and near the front, a group of elderly veterans, many in worn jackets and ball caps, sat in solemn silence. They had come for Grace. Karoline stepped forward with the poise of someone who had stared down CNN anchors and Beltway bullies. But this wasn't about politics. It was about one good woman who had been railroaded by a broken system. And Karoline was about to tear it open. "Your Honor," she began, voice steady, "I bring forth new material evidence that was not available at the time of the trial." Judge Maddox sneered. "Miss Leavitt, this court does not entertain civilian showmanship." "Then maybe," she replied coolly, "this court should stop entertaining false testimony." A murmur rippled across the room. She continued, "We have uncovered compelling evidence that Agent Carter Wells, the DOJ's lead witness, perjured himself under oath, and did so under pressure from superiors in his agency." The judge barked, "Do you have proof?" Karoline clicked her tablet. The audio recording played. Dead silence followed. When the voice on the tape said, "Get Wells to testify. If he blinks, replace him," several people in the gallery gasped. Karoline looked directly at Agent Wells, now seated stiffly beside the prosecution. His eyes darted, his throat bobbed. Bruno growled, low, rumbly, controlled. Then he stood and walked without command straight to Wells. The agent shrank back. Bruno sat down in front of him, stared straight into his eyes, and barked, once, loud, piercing, then again. The room broke. Judge Maddox stood. "Get that dog out of my court." But it was too late. The crowd had seen. Wells was trembling. Karoline held up a document. "Bruno is a decorated military K-9, trained to detect deception and distress. He has never been wrong." The crowd erupted into applause. The judge tried to slam his gavel. But suddenly, Wells stood up. "I lied. I was told to testify. I was told she was dangerous. I was told I'd be fired if I didn't." He broke. Right there on the stand. And outside, in cities and small towns across America, a movement began. The moment Carter Wells uttered those two words, "I lied," the courtroom ceased being a courtroom. It became a reckoning. Gasps flew like startled birds across the gallery. Judge Maddox slammed his gavel hard enough to crack the wood, but even that sharp thunder couldn't silence the roar of emotion boiling over from the crowd. A woman near the back began to weep. A man in a navy hat clenched his jaw, his hand gripped around an old veteran's cane. And at the center of it all, unmoved, Bruno stared up at the man who had just shattered the government's case into pieces. Karoline stepped forward slowly, every breath deliberate, her voice calm, but underneath, a controlled fury. "You lied under oath. You sent a woman, a hero, to her death." Wells looked down, ashamed. "I didn't know she was innocent at first. I just followed orders. They told me she was dangerous, that she leaked information, that she was a threat to national security. I didn't question it." "You didn't question it," Karoline repeated coldly. "That excuse has killed more good people than any bullet." The silence that followed was suffocating. A moral silence. The kind that forces everyone in the room to confront something ugly about power, about obedience, about fear. Judge Maddox was red-faced now. "This testimony is inadmissible without full cross-examination and review. This proceeding is out of order." But no one was listening to him anymore, because Bruno barked, and the truth had already been unleashed. Outside the courthouse, the press had caught wind of the drama inside. The story had exploded. Within hours, headlines raced across cable tickers. Leavitt exposes DOJ scandal. Military K-9 uncovers federal lies. Fall of Judge Maddox, calls for review intensify. People didn't go to work that day. They sat at home, in diners, in barbershops, in senior centers across the nation, watching a live stream that was now being replayed by every major news outlet. Grace Dalton's face, once paraded as an alleged traitor, now stared solemnly back from every screen, not with fear, but with dignity. Karoline refused every interview. Instead, she returned to the courthouse the next morning with two things: a motion to vacate the sentence and reopen the case based on perjury and prosecutorial misconduct. A Bible Grace had once signed for a young girl during a community policing event. She left it on the judge's bench. "Because even when the law forgets God, grace doesn't," she said. That day, the hearing reopened. This time, led by a different judge, Elaine Barnett. Retired, but summoned back under emergency oversight. She stood as Karoline presented the audio evidence again, the memos, the witness statements. But most importantly, she allowed Grace Dalton's character to be spoken. One by one, people from across the country testified. A mother whose daughter Grace had rescued from a drug den. A retired soldier Grace had pulled from a wrecked vehicle on the side of the highway. A teenage boy, now an honor student, who said, "She looked at me like I mattered, like I wasn't just a criminal waiting to happen." Even a pastor from Grace's small hometown showed up, eyes glistening. She didn't carry her badge like a weapon. She carried it like a calling. And all the while, Bruno sat near Karoline, quiet, still, alert, like he understood, like he remembered. At one point, when the testimonies became too much, when even the seasoned judge had to remove her glasses and wipe her eyes, Karoline placed a gentle hand on Bruno's back. "Almost there," she whispered. Then the final moment came. Judge Barnett asked Carter Wells to return to the stand. He didn't resist. He looked hollow now, the weight of his actions written in every tremor of his fingers. "I wish I had never said what I said," he whispered. "I wish I had just been brave." Karoline arose. She didn't attack. She didn't ridicule. Instead, she asked one simple question. "Would you testify under oath to that right now and submit to federal review?" Wells nodded. "Yes, I will." Judge Barnett turned to the court recorder. "Strike the former testimony. Enter the new confession into record. The previous sentence is suspended pending full review. Officer Grace Dalton is hereby removed from death row, effective immediately." The courtroom didn't erupt. It wept. People sobbed. Veterans stood and saluted. Someone shouted, "Thank God," through cracking voice. And Karoline, fierce, composed Karoline, let her shoulders drop for the first time in weeks. Bruno barked. Just once. And this time, it felt like a prayer. Outside, the steps of the courthouse filled with citizens holding signs, flags, and tears. An old woman approached Karoline, her hands trembling. "My husband was a cop. They ruined his name too, but no one ever believed us. Today, you made us feel seen." Karoline hugged her gently. "We all deserve to be seen, especially the ones who protect without asking for applause." Bruno licked the woman's hand. She smiled. "Good boy," she whispered, and he wagged his tail. By the next morning, it wasn't just the courthouse that was buzzing. It was the whole country. A groundswell had started, and for the first time in a long time, it wasn't coming from politicians or celebrities or media pundits. It came from regular people, from truck drivers on long hauls who tuned into the trial on AM radio, from widows in small towns who lit candles for Grace, from veterans who hadn't stood in a crowd since Desert Storm, but now carried signs that read, "Justice for one is justice for all." Karoline walked outside to find nearly 2,000 people gathered in front of the federal courthouse. Some wore police uniforms, others military fatigues. Many held hands, some knelt, many cried. And when Grace Dalton stepped through the doors, free for the first time in months, a cheer rose that shook the pavement beneath their feet. She looked thinner. Her hair was grayer, her cheeks sunken. But her posture was still military straight. And when she saw Bruno, her lips broke into a smile so genuine it melted half the crowd. Bruno ran to her. She dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around him. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. Behind them, Karoline stood still, letting the moment breathe. But the story was far from over. Inside, Judge Maddox was facing the consequences. The Justice Department had launched an internal investigation. His role in approving a case riddled with falsified evidence was under scrutiny. Legal analysts debated whether he would face impeachment or retire early to avoid disgrace. Karoline didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She knew too well that the rot ran deeper than just one man. This wasn't about punishing one judge. This was about reminding the system who it was supposed to serve. And right now, it was the people reminding Washington. Karoline sat down for the first and only interview she agreed to do on a live stream organized by a local high school civics teacher. No network suits, no spin, just a webcam, a wooden desk, and an American flag in the background. "Why'd you do it?" the teacher asked. Karoline took a breath. "Because I remember what my brother used to say," she replied. He was a Marine, and before every mission, he'd whisper to Bruno, "If I don't make it back, make sure they know the truth." She looked into the camera. "That dog kept his promise, so I kept mine." And Bruno? Well, Bruno became a national symbol. Veterans groups requested his appearance at events. Children wrote letters addressed to Bruno the hero dog. Churches asked if he could visit to comfort the grieving. He didn't bark much anymore. He didn't need to. One bark had changed the world. Weeks later, Congress held an emergency session. Whistleblower protection laws were strengthened. Judges came under new federal ethics reviews. The DOJ issued a formal apology to Grace Dalton, one she accepted with humility, but not before adding, "You didn't just fail me, you failed the oath." Her words made it into history books. And so did Bruno. Karoline returned to New Hampshire briefly. She needed rest, but rest didn't mean silence. She received thousands of handwritten letters. One from a retired sheriff in Georgia. "Karoline, you made this old man believe again." Another from a woman in Kansas. "My husband died trying to expose corruption. They called him crazy, but you proved he wasn't." Karoline read every single one, because they weren't just letters. They were wounds and confessions and hopes. Then, one day, Karoline got a call from the office of the president. The voice on the other end said, "Miss Leavitt, the nation owes you a debt. Would you be willing to help us make sure this never happens again?" Karoline looked down at Bruno. He tilted his head, waiting. She smiled. "I think we already started." The invitation from the president wasn't a press stunt. It was real. Karoline arrived in Washington not in a motorcade, but in a humble SUV with Bruno beside her. No handlers, no stage lighting. Just her and the dog who had done what an entire federal agency refused to do, tell the truth. The meeting wasn't long. It didn't need to be. The president offered her a role in an oversight panel aimed at preventing this kind of miscarriage of justice from ever happening again. Karoline declined the title, but not the mission. "Change shouldn't come from power," she said. "It should come from people." She chose to travel the country instead, not as a politician, but as a witness. A witness to what happens when good people remain silent. The tour began in Grace Dalton's hometown. A small church opened its doors. The pews were packed before sundown. On stage, Grace and Karoline sat side by side. They didn't give speeches. They listened. One by one, folks stood to share their own stories of injustice. Wrongful arrests, silenced whistleblowers, forgotten veterans. And in the middle aisle, Bruno sat. Silent, watching, remembering. When one elderly man broke down mid-sentence, Bruno walked over and laid his head in the man's lap. The sobs stopped, and something deeper took over the room, healing. In Alabama, they held a candlelight vigil for the fallen. Karoline read names of those who had died fighting corruption from within. In Iowa, she met a judge who had retired early, rather than issue a sentence he knew was wrong. They hugged, quietly, the kind of hug that says, "I understand." In Montana, an entire high school civics class wrote essays titled, "Why Bruno Matters." Karoline read every single one. One ended with, "Courage has 4 legs and a handler who listens." She hung that one on her office wall. Months passed. The trial faded from the headlines. The media moved on. But the people didn't. Bruno's bark became a symbol. Artists painted murals. Poets wrote verses. One pastor began every sermon with the words, "And when the dog barked, truth was heard." At a veterans parade in Michigan, a Marine with one leg walked the full route just to place a medal around Bruno's neck. The medal read, "In valor, truth. In truth, peace." But the most unexpected moment came in a quiet town in Texas. Karoline and Grace were scheduled to speak at a local school assembly. Simple, nothing fancy. Midway through the Q&A, a little girl no older than 8 stood up. Her hands shook. "My daddy was in jail for something he didn't do," she said. "He died there. They said he was guilty, but I knew he wasn't." The room fell silent. Karoline walked down from the stage. She didn't say a word. She simply knelt before the girl and held her. Bruno walked up beside them, sat, and placed a paw gently on the girl's shoe. The girl smiled through her tears. "I think he would have liked your dog," she whispered. Karoline replied, "I think he still does." Eventually, Karoline returned to New Hampshire. She declined several offers to run for office. Justice doesn't need more microphones, she said. It needs more watchdogs. She opened a foundation in her brother's name. Its mission: provide legal and emotional support to whistleblowers, wrongly accused officers, and families shattered by institutional betrayal. Grace was appointed director. Bruno, he remained the heart. Every day, he walked the halls of the small brick building where survivors gathered, where lawyers fought, where justice whispered. One bark at a time. They say sometimes it takes a storm to reveal the cracks in the house. But sometimes it takes a dog. A scarred, quiet German shepherd who refused to look away when everyone else did. Bruno reminded America that truth doesn't yell, it doesn't tweet, it doesn't grandstand. It stands. It watches. And when the time comes, it speaks. Loud, clear, undeniable. With one bark, he turned the tide. With one woman by his side, he changed a nation. If you believe courage still matters, that honor isn't outdated, and that one voice, no matter how small, can start a movement, then share this story. Let the bark be heard, and never ever stop listening. Subscribe now to join a growing community that believes in truth, faith, and standing tall when it counts. Because when Bruno barked, America finally listened.